Hey everyone, I am going to narrate over this video. It's the first time I've done this. I figured that I'd add some content to it, make it a bit more engaging, try and give some insight into this piece. Yeah, I think it'll be fun. So the piece started with a brief, which I got from the winner of the Fruit People competition. They wanted to see a witch riding a mecha dragon. And I was like, I want to do something a bit different. At first, like you can see the sketch that's just whizzed by. It's for some crazy lizard thing. Really wanted to try and get like a unique head design, and it wasn't really working. It felt too goofy. Perhaps just the angle that I had it at. But in the end, I was looking at a lot of the Greg Rutkowski's dragons. I'm a big fan of those, and the big elongated neck and epic wingspan with this like huge muscle underneath. That really appealed. I wanted to make something that felt powerful, and also heavy because this whole thing's made of metal. And so I started off with this. Was quite happy with the curve that I had going through this. Quite an extreme overlap to really try and put the dragon in space, like make a point about the space between the foreground and the background. And then you can see here, I actually decided that to try and make this as believable as possible, I'd sort of work out where the actual hinges were. So joints that I need to move in all directions I have as spherical balls. And then like anything that has a circle motif implies that it's going to move around an axis. You can see the little dotted lines that I've put in. And so the neck, for example, it articulates up and down at each of those circular joints, and then there's a cylindrical joint which allows it to wrap around to the side. And I think that's... It can't like twist. It has no twist in its neck, but otherwise most movements are actually accounted for, which is nice. It's nice to have that sense of realism, which I don't think I normally go for particularly. I'll think about shapes first, just go for something that kind of implies functionality. And it was just nice to really think about it this time, go a little bit further. I mean, there's still a bunch of things that the dragon can't do, but it's easy to understand what it's capable of. And the general push for realism is something that I took from Axel Salvold. I wanted this piece, and we'll get to this later when I start putting in colors and values, but I wanted it to feel far more grounded in realism. So the way I treat the lighting, the way I treat the materials, and of course at the beginning, very early stages, how I actually designed the mechanical components. So you can see the dragon's really taking the center stage in this piece. I've put the witch on top, kind of put in some of the supplies and things that they may have. I'm thinking this is like a duo that explore. She's presumably using some kind of magic to communicate her wishes to the dragon, so they communicate somehow. Perhaps it's more like a golem in terms of how it animates. It could all be sort of fueled or at least powered by some magical force rather than it being a sentience of its own. After all, I'm not sure, whether it can eat. It doesn't appear to have any way to actually swallow things. Like, perhaps they just fuel the center. In fact, now that I'm actually saying this stuff out loud, I'm realizing that there's a whole bunch more I could have added to this piece. In fact, there's the potential that I'm going to come up with an idea that I'm too allured by, that I just go back and make those edits. But I have spent a lot of time poking and prodding on this piece already, so I'm probably not going to. I'll try and resist, but who knows? Who knows if I can resist? On that topic, I find that whenever you actually explain something out loud, you end up having to really consolidate what's important and what's not in your mind. To explain it something clearly and succinctly to somebody forces you to boil down what you've actually created. And you start to realize what's important about the design and what's not. Like for me at the beginning, all of these small functional elements, they seem to be the most important thing, but now I'm thinking, well, it's all well and good that I have these articulate joints, but how does this dragon even get its power to move? And that's just not something I even thought of at the beginning. So I've told myself to do this before, and I'm going to tell myself to do it again, and I'll tell you all to do it too. Try and explain your ideas out loud. or even just write them down. I think writing down helps, and I will do that occasionally in the canvas itself. But as is clearly evident here, saying it out loud can't be beat. Anyway, at this point I'm starting to try and block in some colours. The main idea for the dragon, because it's got all of these articulate joints, I wanted it to be rusted over, kind of like a bronze patina across the entire dragon, so it's primarily this deep cyan colour, verging on green. And then all the joints where there's regular movement and regular friction between the pieces, I'm going to have this exposed shiny copper. You can see I'm putting it in now. And this is where like the true colour of the metal shines through. So on the side I just have a bunch of references of statues that have been worn away. A lot of the time it's where people have touched or sat on them, and it's like has this soft meld between the oxidation and the revealed pure metal underneath. And so you can see in here I've gone for some areas that are like a clear, clean scratch, almost like you've got a file and you've scraped it across the surface. And later on, when I start to add in details, you can see I'll put in like scored scratch lines going through that show the direction of movement, almost like grit and things have been caught in the joints and then dragged through with the motion. And then there's areas underneath the witch which I have like had a much softer, as if it's a constant contact with something like fabric, something soft that's slowly wearing away at the outer layer. And really, these things are stuff that I observed in my reference that I gathered. I might put my reference sheet with the ArtStation post. I think that might be interesting to see. Or maybe, who knows, maybe I'll even edit it in here, but I doubt that. And it's elements of realism like that I often miss out on if I don't actually look for reference when I'm working entirely from imagination. Unless something is in the forefront of my mind, I'm not going to end up including it in a piece. So it's really important that you find, at least for stuff where you're trying to capture this extra level of realism, you find reference that informs you on the details that you would otherwise forget. Anyway, you can see here that my drab overcast look from before really wasn't cutting it for me. I still want to have the dragon almost entirely in shadow, because then I can really focus on just the local values of these materials, instead of like creating interest with a big bright area of light and then almost neglecting the contrast that comes simply from the local color and the ambient occlusion. So you can see here I've started to put in some of those scratches, which really help with explaining like how these elements articulate. Like the drawer itself has a multitude of circular shapes on it, and obviously one of them's the biggest, and I've made it the biggest because it is the true pivot point. But in case there's any doubt, now you've got these lines, you can see that the circle's origin point would be right in the middle, and it just really goes like helps solidify the realism of this joint that's going to be constantly moving open and closed. Yeah, as for the clouds, that was another thing where at first I just went, I can make up some cloud shapes. I'll make it kind of overcast, I'll put some fluffy details in, and it really wasn't working for me. I ultimately went back to reference. I went to find some clouds which really added something to the scene. Because ultimately, I've kept it very simple. There's a sky, a very simplistic ground, and then the dragon. So I wasn't too worried at this point. Like having tested out the previous sky, I wasn't too worried that this sky would detract from the dragon. I didn't think that was too much of an issue. And if anything, it'll be a nice point of contrast where I have this full light range from indirect sunshine to in shadow in the sky, which is fun and dynamic, and then the dragon's almost the opposite, where it's just a really controlled and consistent color scheme, where I really focus on subtle value shifts rather than these big sweeping graphic shapes. So ultimately, going to this made the whole piece feel so much more open. And right at the beginning, when I was talking about making sure the dragon felt like it was filling space, like really filling a space between what is right next to the camera and then swooping back into the environment, well, this sky really helped that come through, because now it feels so much more open. You can see overlapping clouds, you can see the space in between. And it's far more appealing. It feels like you want to see the dragon flap its wings and soar up in between those clouds. Something I really like about clouds in general is that you get this kind of sense that they're a huge piece of architecture when you start getting like the overlaps right. And I actually struggle with this quite a bit. But giving clouds a sense of space, suddenly there's so many like nooks and crevices that you can explore. It feels like something you really want to get inside and move around. Something far more than like this flat environment where basically you can see everything at once. There's little intrigue as to what's on the ground, because it's flat and we can basically see all of it at once, even if it's at such an extreme angle. But clouds and things, they hide so much of the sky above that it naturally creates this intrigue about what's behind there. What comes to mind is Lapta cast in the sky. Like, I really enjoyed its way of slowly revealing what's been hidden all this time. And like at first you literally just see this huge cloud in the sky, and we know it's hiding something, but we have to wait and see what that thing is. And that like intrigue that keeps you really invested in finding out what this beautiful mystical thing in the sky is. It perpetuates the whole film, and like I think of anything else, the world building and the sense of scale that the film portrays is by far my favorite bit. So trying to get some sort of sense for that in the sky here. But yeah, moving on from that, you can see I'm fiddling around with the dragon's values quite a bit. I think at this point I wanted to make sure that the dragon looked like it was in shadow, and I worried that the lighter greenish color was making it feel like it had too much of a warm light on it. I think ultimately I actually reverted again, because this started to feel far closer to my previous approaches to how I'd communicate shadows, which was really to oversaturate and go far too deep into the saturated blue, which works very well. Like, it's very appealing, especially when there's a bright and warm light to counteract it. But in this case, it really wasn't what I was going for, which is trying to get this more realistic sense. But I think at the time I made the change and it felt good, because a lot of the time bringing blue into the shadows it separates them, makes them feel really deep, and it's immediately very appealing. So at least for this point, I was clearly happy enough with the value that I could start going into details. And then yeah, there's a long process of me slowly adding detail to make this metal feel real, feel worn and used, and like I want this dragon to look like it's an ancient artifact that the witch has reanimated or dug up. And later on I actually put some ruins of other dragons in the ground, so the same sort of shaped twisting metal sort of buried in the ground of these huge plains. And there's no explicit story here, but I wanted to at least give a sense that this world has something that's sort of forgotten or lost in it. And people can interpret it in any way they like, but if the interpretation is that this dragon's been dug up or pieced back together after years of scavenging, that's great. I'm gonna say that that's what I intended. So I hope that sort of thing comes through. But yeah, I'd roughly blocked in the witch at this point, because I knew it was important to make sure I had I balanced the focal point between the dragon's head and her properly. It was a nice point again to really focus on the changes in local value, like really showing the difference between the darkish metal tones, the dark clothes she wears, and then the paler skin in comparison. And bringing that through even in the shadows is something that I find really appealing in Axel's work. And again, his artwork was the gold standard at this point. It's the thing I was referencing for how to tackle the lighting. And yeah, I realized that like the base of the scene was starting to feel a little empty. It was lacking the depth that I was trying to get with the dragon. So my technique there was to make sure that I have multiple points of contact, if not close contact with the ground. So having the dragon's front feet and then back legs all staggered from the camera. I think that's the thing that really gives you that sense that it's taking up a huge space in front of you. Same with the wings. And I actually bring them down before they pointed up into the sky, but I brought down their tips to almost touch the ground because, again, it really positioned the dragon in the scene. It made it feel far more present because I could put a direct shadow underneath. And that sort of contact shadow and like the blend where two surfaces meet, that's the thing that really gives this impression of 3D space and interaction within the scene. And without it, things can sort of feel floaty. They're not really there. Like the dragon could lose a lot of weight. Even if I pressed the feet further into the ground, the sense of these huge wings being as huge as they are doesn't come through as much unless they're treated as if they're really heavy objects that, you know, require a lot of energy to keep up in the air. So it's far more efficient to have them sort of slide across the ground instead. So I talked about the statues a little bit, but I think I got sidetracked. I wanted those to, again, just imply some sort of sense of this lost civilization. So statues that are either ambiguous in their shape or human figures that are missing elements. It's like a shorthand for this civilization's lost and in disrepair. These statues were placed here and have slowly worn away as they get forgotten. So it's a fairly easy way to like imply this ancient space, but I think it's very effective, and you know I'm still very enamored by those like the Easter Island heads and things where you come across ancient carvings that are so huge and so robust that even after thousands of years they remain standing tall and like a immovable aspect of the landscape now. So the important thing was to make sure that they didn't distract too much from the dragon. Like I liked the composition. You saw earlier on I've had these really big statues that towered overhead, and that's really cool. It makes it feel even more spacious and epic. Like you can start to imagine that you're the dragon, or you're the rider of the dragon, going through this space and there's these huge objects towering overhead. Part of that feeling comes from the like having it being cut off completely by the top of the canvas, whereas the dragon like is mostly contained apart from its wings. Nothing reaches the very top of the canvas, and so having something tower above it and go way beyond what we can see in this image, that's what brings the sense of its enormity. But the problem was putting those in, it started making this whole piece far more about the environment than it was the characters, and ultimately this was a character design piece. Like I had to design a witch riding a mecha dragon. That was my brief. And so I had to make sure I go back to that and stick to it. Not get distracted with like creating some lost civilization. And so yeah, I made them much smaller, like really push them back into the environment, and ideally have them as like a way to sort of fill in the space, add to the sense of depth, but ultimately not distract from what is supposed to be the main focal point. And on the topic of focal points, when I was designing the clouds, this large white chunk that is like the brightest area of the scene, it was quite a simple choice. I put that behind the focal point so that the silhouette of the dragon reads really clearly, and it's clear which part of the dragon you should be looking at first. Like you're not supposed to be looking at the feet, the mouth and teeth. That's where like some of the finest and most sort of regular detail is. Like humans like to latch onto patterns, and so this regular pattern of teeth going across is immediately very appealing. And so it makes it sort of indisputably the focal point. It also has the most material definition, probably the brightest color in the scene too, because the bronze that pops through from this fairly bright but comparatively muted green patina, that's where the real color pop is. I think the only thing I have after that is I introduced a few more colors into the witch towards the end, because I wanted to make sure that she, despite being much smaller, still read as like an important element of the scene. But yeah, I think we're actually getting close to the end of this this process. But adding on the equipment that the witch carries on the back, I think that was actually a very, very important part of making this feel realistic, or making it feel more engaging, because we start to see sort of a little story in our head. What's she going to do when night falls? In fact, the sun is setting right now, so we can imagine they've done their exploring, they've surveyed this world, and it's time for the dragon to like lay its head down on the ground. She'll unpack her stuff, get out the big pot, and cook up a tasty stew, I guess, with all the ingredients she's got. So that kind of stuff where, to be honest, even again saying it out loud makes me think it'll be really nice to illustrate that. Do a little follow-up scene where I show the camp where she sat down and started to cook her meal. But yeah, just including these elements, they start to let your imagination take this image to the places that I don't explicitly show. And it's the same thing with all the other elements that I've included in the background. So, you know, what are they going to do when they go up and really inspect these statues up close? Are they going to dig up the ruins or the ancient machinery we see in the ground? And I think that's like the stuff which makes an illustration more engaging and something that you can look at for a lot longer. The other side of that is, of course, I detailed the hell out of this piece. I wanted it to be my next like big fancy thing where I could just like really chew on it for a long time and get everything I could from it. I think a lot of the time I have this mentality that a piece isn't finished until it's taken to this polished painting level. And it can be problematic because I've started to find my eyes are like really sensitive to this fine detail and careful shape design, to the extent that when I'm sketching, it's very easy to immediately get wrapped up in adding these final polished details without actually having a solid foundation underneath, or even a story. Like a lot of the time, and I think this piece is a good example too, the story comes afterwards because I realize it's important and I should really try and make this piece more engaging by adding something that people can imagine, latch onto, and understand beyond just an image full of nice shapes and nice colors. And starting a piece with a story in mind is always going to be more effective, because you can design every element about the scene to support that, rather than trying to squeeze in elements of story, having basically ignored it since the beginning. So, a little tip, which maybe having said it here, I'm going to start actually putting into practice, but I really do need to start thinking about story first, and then the illustrative details second. Like pieces like this are almost me trying to push this finish to the next level. Like I want to make improvements on what I've done before, but if I focus purely on this like technical finish, at some point the art's no longer going to speak to people. It's not going to inspire them to think more about this world. It's just going to be a technical display. Sort of like, imagine you did a study of a photo and you made it perfectly photoreal. You know, the better you are at that, the closer it becomes just like the photo, and in many ways the less interesting it is, the less engaging it is. And I don't really think this is the case with styles, because I have picked a style that I really like. It's like a combination of sort of a more stylized shape design, but with crunchy and realistic materials applied to it. I think that sort of roughly describes what I really like as a general style, but leaning into that means that it's never going to become realistic completely. It's never going to be realism. So it should always retain some sort of interest because of that, but continuing to polish a scene and detail everything in it, unless there's something interesting there to detail, then there's almost no point to do this, because when someone looks at the scene, they can look at details forever, but if they have no meaning, then there's like no drive to keep trying to find elements. Like in this case, you look along the dragon and you can appreciate all of the joints. That's probably the most interesting and engaging part of the piece, is that you can see how all of the joints work, and they have been constructed in meticulous detail. But you then look to the sky, and I didn't spend as long adding small details to the sky, so your eye kind of moves around it quickly and then moves on. It doesn't add anything else, like there's no extra life in the sky, which of course there's many reasons you choose to and choose not to add birds or something. Like I wanted this place to feel solitary, so I avoided extra wildlife and stuff, but it's worth considering. Like every aspect of your piece can engage the viewer for a bit longer, and it's not always refinement and details that do that. A lot of the time, even something that's left ambiguous but is like made through loose paint strokes that could imply something may actually be far more engaging, because it forces the viewer to really think about what the artist was trying to portray with these strokes. It lets their imagination fill in a lot more of the uncertainties, but it's actually like getting the viewer to use their brain rather than having everything given to you exactly how it should have been. Anyway, I've rambled on a bunch more since the video ended. I'll probably edit some zoom shots to this or something, but yeah, that's all. That's my thoughts about this piece. I'm pretty pleased with it in the end. I had a bunch of feedback from a load of people, so thank you very much to them. And thank you, Axel Salvold. I'll link him in the description, but his paintings are gorgeous. I don't think I quite captured that level of control he has with his values and materials, but perhaps I'll just need to try again. Something which I obviously did differently was that I detailed the crap out of it, and he's far more restrained and far more selective with how he details his pieces, which really explains how they can function. Like it basically brings the focus back to how important values and story are beyond just the crispy detail that you finished it with. But I'm happy with this piece, and man, it took a long time to make, so I think it was worth it. Alright, well, I might do something like this again, because firstly, it's good practice. Secondly, it means I actually start thinking about my ideas a lot more, and hopefully it's helpful for some of you. Alright, this has been fun. Bye-bye.